Everything's on.
Good.
Jim, go ahead and start the
Yeah, good morning, everybody. Welcome to our second episode for season 2 of Smart Futures with Dr. Marv Langston and myself, Jim Petrosini. And today we have the honor of having Rob Efrus from the Washington, D.C. area. And Rob, good morning, and maybe you can do a little introduction on yourself.
Sure. Robert Efrus, founder and CEO of Efrus Federal Advisors. Let me first say it's an honor to be on the podcast today with both Dr. Langston and you, Jim, and kudos on your great government careers. And the notion of government service has always been an important value to me. My father and brother both served honorably in World War II and Vietnam, respectively. And I served 4 years in NASA. There was no draft at that time, but the notion of government service as a noble calling is a value that I've always embraced. And so it's great to be with you today. I came to Washington 40 years ago to get an undergraduate and graduate degree at George Washington. During that time, I had internships with the Food and Drug Administration, the Department of Labor, and the United States Trade Representative. After all that, I got selected as a presidential fellow and got a great job at NASA's Office of Legislative Affairs. Worked in support of what's called legislative reference, which is the process by which agencies coordinate their views on legislation with OMB, worked in the CFO shop, got to work on inflation-related escalators, which is a key issue today that agencies are going back and forth on. And then I ended up being a congressional liaison on behalf of the space shuttle program, working with luminaries like Dr. Jim Abramson, who headed up the space shuttle program for a while. And then I was also involved in the initial stages of how the space station was conceived as an $8 billion endeavor and how that was being sold to the Congress. And then I left my mark at NASA in working on a task force that focused on establishing policies in coordination with the White House to expand private sector investment in space. I got a chance to do a 1-year rotation on the Hill, work for a United States senator that sponsored legislation that was enacted into law by President Reagan called the Commercial Space Launch Act, which governs space activity, space launches, and the return of those payloads and launch vehicle elements back to Earth. So it was a great foundation. Started an aerospace services company with my former boss at NASA, catering primarily to DoD vendors, selling back into DoD and NASA. And then in the early 90s, I shifted to the federal IT space. And since then, I've been providing outsourced lobbying and business development services to primarily the public sector management teams of software vendors selling back to the federal government.
Thanks, Rob. One of the themes today is kind of understanding how the Department of Defense is trying to move faster, quicker, shorten their development times and their processes. Can you maybe talk a little bit about the President's executive order and this whole movement towards open source software?
Sure. The elements of the Cyber Executive Order 14028 that I've been most focused on involve Section 4, which relates to software security, which is an issue I've been involved in since 2010, working with Congress, the House and Senate Armed Services Committee, to strengthen the priority being given to software assurance within DoD. And I'm very happy to say that both DoD and the intelligence community have improved their software assurance capabilities dramatically over that time frame and are very much leading civilian agencies. But the rubber's going to hit the road very soon with regard to the Office of Management and Budget tasking the FAR Council, Federal Acquisition Regulatory Council, to enact rules that can be included in solicitation documents, requiring that vendors attest to the security worthiness of their software and its alignment with the NIST Secure Software Development Framework. The notion of open source software is another area where DoD has taken a leadership role. They released a policy document back in 2009, blessing, if you will, the use of open source software, touting its benefits in terms of rapid development, innovation, collaboration, etc. And the issue that I'm most closely involved with in that regard is helping to educate federal IT stakeholders in both the executive branch and Congress on the differences between free and supported open source software. I lead a coalition of supported open source software vendors called the Coalition for Enterprise Open Source Software in Government. And in addition to educating these stakeholders on the differences between free and supported, we've also tried to educate the contracting acquisition community on the fact that the government isn't always consistent in how it acquires and uses open source software. The notion of a program manager downloading a free version of a software, providing a task order to an integrator to modify that software and to, in essence, productize it, runs afoul of the FAR to the extent that that free download is indeed an acquisition-related event governed by the FAR, requiring the contracting officer to consider the lifecycle costs of modifying that free as compared to what's available commercially out of the box, as well as considering the extent to which that modification process could potentially result in applications that aren't as secure as the supported version alternatives. And so both of those areas have gotten a lot of attention lately. The Log4j vulnerability that was discovered earlier this year resulted in an open source software security summit at the White House back in the February-March timeframe, and then only within the last month or so, the Open Source Security Foundation and the Linux Foundation got a whole bunch of stakeholders together, including representatives of the vendor community, to talk about steps that the open source community could take to strengthen the security of open source software. That's a long-winded answer to suggest that this cyber executive order, combined with some Hill oversight, is really driving change in terms of how software writ large is being used and consumed by the federal agencies, and what it means for the open source software community in particular.
Marv, you got any questions?
Yeah, I was waiting for my background noise to slow down, but Tree was still active. So Rob, that was an excellent discussion. Can you just talk a little bit about the trade-offs that need to be made FAR-wise or otherwise between proprietary software licensing versus supported software open source?
Well, in terms of our coalition, we try and steer clear of a couple of things. One, we try and steer clear of any statements or actions that would be detrimental to the open source software community, to the extent that there's a time and a place for free and supported, free being aligned to a project-related requirements, and supported being aligned with an enterprise broadly deployed requirement. The second piece is we really try and avoid direct head-to-head discussions about supported OSS versus proprietary, but the FAR treats both of those as commercial items, and the rules governing the use of both are very similar. And but what often happens, as I mentioned, with the OSS open source software world, is that the contracting officer community isn't as educated on the nuances of the free download including a licensing agreement that kind of gets a box checked, all the way up to the notion of buying COTS software, proprietary products, most of which contain open source software elements. And so part of the reason for the summit that I mentioned earlier, both the White House summit and the Linux Foundation summit, was primarily addressed at the fact that companies like Google and Cisco and Microsoft and others embed free elements of community-based OSS into their proprietary products. And that process does not reduce the threat landscape. It increases the threat landscape, especially when you consider the provenance of that open source software and the extent to which it could be being sourced from China, Russia, Iran, et cetera.
Yeah, I guess the summary is it's a huge educational issue, right? When I talk to some of the open source based vendors, I say you just got to continue to educate people on, open source, open code, commercially supported licenses. It's because most people don't understand it.
And there's another element too that we haven't discussed, and that's the whole reuse piece, of government developed software, and the code.gov initiative out of OMB, and DoD has been a supporter of that with, I believe, forge.mil. And so there's a notion of reusing what the government has already paid for, which you can argue is never a bad idea.
Yeah, I was going to mention that I've said for years now that we usually do not write code, we assemble code. We assemble it from open source and add linkages to pieces of open source. So all your points, I think, are very valid for what's going on today. And we see that happening more and more, especially in the S&T community, where S&T projects have to invent something, but they rarely will integrate COTS products. Rather, AI is a good example. They'll start from some open source AI, they'll hire PhDs, they'll modify the product and turn it into a potential government product, but in the end that becomes troublesome for all the reasons that we've talked about. So thank you for bringing all that up.
So Rob, can we shift a little bit over to the buzzword DevSecOps, and specifically the DoD has over 29 different factories, and I think the theme is they want to go fast and use commercial DevSecOps processes, but there's a huge cultural shock to that. And, can you just maybe comment where you see Congress supporting it, where the DoD is going to, and, will in fact succeed?
Sure. The DoD is to be commended for all of its efforts to develop software more agile, to leverage commercial best practices in the DevSecOps arena, to importantly shift security left in the software development process. And so the Congress has been, for the most part, very, very supportive of these efforts. What the jury is out, though, on the extent to which the efforts of those 30 or so software factories will result in or drive a cultural change in the DoD as it relates to software development. I think the institutional challenge is that the federal systems integrators shoulder a lot of that burden, and they have their own way of doing things that one could argue is not as agile as what's being done in the software factories. So, when you look at a Platform One or in the Air Force or a Black Pearl in the Navy, you see a lot of goodness on a number of different fronts, the whole adage of faster, better, cheaper. But culturally, it's going to take a while. I think the Congress has expressed concern about the state of DoD's software development cadre being somewhat anemic and needing to grow. And so they are working very much with the factories and the vendor community to try and grow that. I think they have concern about the extent to which those factories are operating in stovepipes and not collaborating across component lines to share best practices in particular. And so I think, it's an area that is ripe for additional oversight, but the bottom line is programmatically, I think the factory's location at the programmatic level within the services is the right place. The extent to which there needs to be more centralization, one could argue, but I think, as both of you well know, programmatically, those program owners want the control related to how their software is developed, and a mandate from on high may have limited traction in terms of that control issue.
So Rob, let me extend that question a little bit. You mentioned earlier the value of enterprise in open source, because I assume you implied that if we have enterprise licensing, we can secure much greater reduction in price for subscriptions, et cetera. So in the DevSecOps world, if we had a relatively common stack that was enterprise licensed for decent reduced prices, and additional elements for the stack that could be applied to any given program that needs additional pieces to their DevSecOps, it would seem like we could come up with a much better way to build integratable software across the department.
Couldn't agree more. And the notion of a single platform versus disparate tool sets, is a no-brainer. But I think there's a medium there, to the extent that, I do a lot of work in the software security space, and many of these tools interoperate, and that there are APIs. So it doesn't have to be an either or situation where, on the one hand, the department and the services can move toward a single platform, but that doesn't necessarily limit the extent to which other tool sets and other approaches can't be integrated with a single platform approach. Great point.
Yeah, I'm reading Walter Isaacson's The Innovators, and they go to the history of the ARPANET when they wanted to distribute their computer power, right? And all the universities who were working for the DoD said, no, we don't want to share computers. We want our own computers. And they finally figured out, we'll put this little router, and we'll just be the network component, because we're not gonna be able to control the computers at each university. So I see, federating of DevSecOps, because as we know, the DoD's multiple navies, multiple air forces, and they want to have their own control over their own factories, right? So I'm hoping they realize maybe sharing of information will be the way to start.
Yeah.
Well,
Go ahead, Marv.
I was just going to say, that's never going to happen, because Congress helps us out by dividing up the money.
Yep.
So Rob, Iron Triangle, can you maybe explain that? And
Sure. In the DoD contractor world, when you talk about weapon systems, aircrafts, ships, large ticket items, there's been a long-standing term of art called the Iron Triangle, which involves the interrelationship and the self-sustaining relationship between the Department of Defense, Congress, and the vendor community. And they have reinforcing priorities. And I've always taken that, from an academic perspective into practice. And clearly in my NASA days, that was front and center, where you had the big aerospace companies collaborating with the different field centers around the country: Houston, Huntsville, Alabama, Kennedy Space Center in Florida, to name just 3 out of a broader number. And those congressional delegations fought furiously for, in that case, their piece of the manned space pie. What I see in the IT world is a much smaller subset, but I can offer a historical perspective, because I've been doing this a while. And that is, prior to the late 80s, with the Microsoft antitrust action out of the Department of Justice, there was just a handful of IT and software vendors in particular that were working the hill. But after that antitrust proceeding and Microsoft getting religion, because they got dinged through that process, all of the major enterprise IT vendors and many of the second and even third tier companies now all have government relations capabilities. And while the scale is much smaller in terms of how they, in this case, collaborate with DoD and work with a DoD installation that's represented by a member of Congress who sits on a DoD oversight committee, the drill is essentially the same. in that one hand washes the other. DoD gets what it wants, the vendor gets what they want, and the member of Congress can say they're creating jobs in their district. And so that principle has only proliferated over the years.
So Rob, do you view that as a positive or a negative or both?
Well, I have a bias, and as a government relations practitioner, it's a positive because absent that model, the vendors that I represent and the 10,000 lobbyists that are running around Washington represent in support of at last count, a $3 or $4 billion a year industry. That's how the lobbyist earns their keep, how the vendors grow their business, and how, in this case, the Pentagon achieves their outcomes. Now, having said that, having worked with a number over the years of DoD alumni, when I mention the Hill in 8 or 9 times out of 10, I get a thou shalt not response from my former colleagues who formerly were with DoD, that the Hill more is perceived as intrusive, as disrupting mission activities to address tangential priorities. And so I'm sure from the DoD perspective, it's at best a mixed bag. But from the vendor perspective and from the Hill member and staff perspective, companies have a constitutional right to make their case. Members of Congress are, their principal motivation is to get reelected, and if they can generate jobs to do so, that's what their motivation is. And is it a good deal for DoD in terms of the outcomes? I would say my experience has been it's, and again, this is not a universal statement, but in the case of software security and assurance, which was viewed by DoD as a nice to have, not a need to have, the mandates that we were able to get enacted into law changed DoD behavior for the better, to the extent that the software running those mission critical systems was more secure and more resilient to nation state attacks.
Yeah, those are all good points. And I think we all realize, unless you're in the IT space, the things that we build in the DoD to build weapons or undersea warfare systems and submarines, etc., they're not being built anywhere else. So you need a vendor community that actually is dedicated to that. And the community still will allow changes to come in. I think one of the best new examples is in the NASA case, where they are hiring SpaceX to go take care of the new moon program. So I guess the world is working pretty well.
And I have a personal perspective on that, to the extent that, back in the mid 80s, when I was doing my thing with Congress and the White House on commercial space, there was no appetite, for companies to go at risk like SpaceX has done and like others have done, to develop a launch system and then have the government be an anchor tenant. It was the exception. Now it's becoming the rule. I just read that NASA's outsourcing, presumably with a similar model, the development of these very expensive pressurized spacesuits. So it's great to see how things have evolved.
Yeah, I think we talked. You mentioned earlier, the large integrators under FAR Part 15, we get paid by the hour, right? And if to go fast, maybe getting paid by the hour goes against going faster. So these new FAR Part 12 OTA based commercial companies, like I think they call them the shape companies, Anduril, Hawkeye 360, Palantir.
Yep.
They're disrupting. And hopefully that'll affect the rest of the community. One question a lot I bring up is talent acquisition. Does Congress see that, I think this morning I read, the Chinese are building their third carrier. Do they see an issue of how do you attract software developers to go to the defense world when you've got most of these hot commercial companies that are just, they just offer different incentives?
It's a huge challenge. You know, I do, as you can imagine, a lot in cyber, and that is one of the biggest skill gaps in government. Congress explicitly called out the need to grow, as I mentioned, DoD software development cadre. All of the debate and discussion on the what's now called, I believe, the America Competes Act, and was formerly the United States Innovation and Competition Act, all focused on narrowing the competitiveness gap with China on artificial intelligence. And so that skills gap, as it relates to China in particular, is front burner. And I think it's a real challenge for how agencies and the hamstrung personnel system can evolve to meet that. But I do think through programs like the Presidential Innovation Fellows Program and others to get fresh outs from college, on a federal track, I think are really, really what's needed. Another is greater collaboration with industry to make up the shortfall in the interim. I've encouraged a number of my software clients that are doing business with the Pentagon in particular, who have training capabilities and professional services capabilities, to be open-minded about how those capabilities can address some of the skills gap, albeit it's not growing it internal to government organically, but it can be a gap filler.
Oh, well, very well said, Rob. I just heard an interesting statistic about artificial intelligence, that the training time for AI models, which has been exponentially decreasing, is 69% easier than it has been a few years ago. So that just intensifies this whole China issue with respect to AI, and hopefully we'll continue to push it in the right direction. And
yeah, well, the bill's being negotiated between the House and Senate. I think we're going to see action on some compromise version within the next several months, and potential enactment by the end of the year. Big price tag involved, upwards of $50 billion being spent primarily through the National Science Foundation to increase our nation's capacity to provide that talent, but we'll see what happens.
So Rob, we're coming up on the 35-minute mark. Any last thoughts or comments or things you want to leave the audience with?
Sure. I again greatly appreciate this chance to be with you. I think I've had a chance to review and listen to a number of your podcasts, and I think the themes that you all are discussing are spot on. I think they have relevance not only to our government officials, but also to those in industry. And so this, I view this podcast as a great learning platform for a number of different stakeholders. And I would just say in closing that look for some major changes over the next 6 to 12 months in terms of how the government buys and evaluates software, with responsibility for ensuring its security, not only with the vendor community and having to make attestations about what's in that software. We're going to be seeing a lot more about software bill of materials, which is not necessarily a point and click type outcome, but we're also going to see greater responsibility put on the shoulders of agency IT and cyber officials, and ultimately agency heads, to take greater accountability in terms of the resiliency of the software running on their networks. And that's been an area post SolarWinds, post Log4j, that Congress and the Senate in particular, we've seen a resurgence of leadership coming out of the Senate Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Committee. The Senate Armed Services Committee has outstanding talent, that are cyber and IT subject matter experts. And Marv, I heard you loud and clear between the lines about, what does the DoD think of all this direction? But I believe that their hearts are in the right place. and that the dynamic related to evolving our IT and cyber operations and funding and priority to meet the threats globally is heading in the right direction. And I'm very, very proud to be playing a small part in that process. And I really appreciate you having me.
I would say those are excellent comments. I'd just add one comment. I think that one of the most positive things that's happened on the cybersecurity front is that the independent test and evaluation communities have gotten very, very engaged in building their own red teams and taking their red teams into the operational software as a part of the process for test and evaluation. And I think that's exactly where it needs to be. It needs to be beyond the development process. So thank you again for participating. I think it was excellent discussion.
Yeah, and I'd say zero trust, people are starting to, they hear the buzzword, and there's a key component of zero trust called continuous monitoring. So the technology is there that they can monitor code in real time. And, it's a little bit scary, but I think that'll also affect, as opposed to, scanning something and then building a document for 6 months and then, realizing the scan is out of date. So
yeah, what I hear, and I know we're wrapping up, but with regard to zero trust, from the vendor perspective, it's great. There's a lot of excitement about it, and every vendor has their own perspective on zero trust architecture. But there does need to be much more of a funding commitment, in both the defense and non-defense sectors.
Well, thanks, Rob. Enjoy the weekend, and appreciate the time, and look forward to talking to you again. We'll do a round 2 at some point.
Sounds great. You guys have a great day.
Thank you again, Rob.